me go ahead and set it to record. Let me go ahead and share this real fast. Okay. Can you guys see the PowerPoint on your screen? Okay, I'm seeing some nods. That's a good sign. Okay. So let me go ahead and jump in here. Okay. So the agenda here, pretty quick. We've met each other very briefly. So I'm going to go over the program in about, even though it says this will take 45 minutes, I think it will take me probably more about 25 because I'm going to just do the whole scope of it as quickly as I can. And at any point during this, if something kind of pops up that's I'm not making very clear sense, you can use the chat. You can just jump in and interrupt me. I've given this presentation so many times, you're not going to bother me if you jump in. So at any point, I'd rather ask the question than it get lost. Okay. All right. So let's jump in there. In terms of the general overview of the program, there's a few things that I think make us a little bit unique because there are other instructional design programs within the CSU, and I actually do recommend students, every open house that I have, I always recommend students to look at the brevity of options because there's some really good instructional design programs across the CSU. Unfortunately, the major is dwindling across the CSU in terms of its offerings. So I think we're only about one of 3 schools that still have an ID program. So that's just something to keep in mind. But with that in mind, our faculty, much like you, come from a variety of backgrounds. So Dr. Budsu, the chair of the department and also the program director for the the online program, she was a K-12 teacher in China who taught computer science before she came to the States and did a PhD in instructional design and started teaching computer science and instructional design classes at CSUMB, and she's been here the last 14 years. Dr. Miguel Lara, kind of a similar background, did a bachelor's and master's in Mexico, taught computer science at the K-12 level in Mexico and also at the university level there before coming here, completing his PhD, working as an instructional designer in the corporate sector for years, and now has been teaching at our university for roughly about 5 years. And then we have folks from Fortune 500 company backgrounds with instructional design, so we can give that breadth of the corporate sector of instructional design. And we have folks who've been teaching English as a second language in terms of their expertise for instructional design, and many folks have K-12 expertise. So really, the breadth is quite wide. And the beautiful thing is, even interestingly enough, I know one of you is kind of teaching younger folks. We have the expertise there too. And unfortunately, I don't know if the faculty member is going to be back this fall, but we had a former preschool teacher who used to teach preschool and ultimately was using education technology at that level. So it really is a unique field that's beneficial to any age group and any learner type. And that's really the beautiful side of the whole program, is that you can really tailor it to your audience. And so with that in mind, we do focus on instructional technology in both corporate and educational settings. And generally speaking, our students come from 3 different backgrounds. A third of them teach at some level in either the P to 12 system, somewhere within that level. We also have another third that come roughly from higher education, either at the community college or traditional 4-year university level in terms of employment. And then the last group is generally a mixture of kind of corporate sector, all types of training, project management, ID type jobs. So it's really quite broad in terms of the student body that we have as well, which is kind of nice for you all as the learners, because the way I try to describe it at each open house is that it's a lot like, part of the benefit of the program is not only the curriculum, but the teammates that you end up working with and the fellow students that you get to work with, because you're going to be able to pick up how instructional design and these types of technologies are used in so many different settings. It kind of rounds out your tool belt, if you will. So it's a very unique program in that setting, because most of these types of programs are offered with solely the K-12 education sector in mind. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. And then lastly, naturally, this program is also focusing very heavily on preparing professionals to use technology in both distance settings and in more traditional face-to-face course settings. So something I didn't allude to in my introduction is that I also teach computer science classes at CSUMB, and I use my miseducation every class that I'm there. And so even the technology that I'm learning, it's not just for online learning, it can be very beneficial for face-to-face settings as well. So I think that's the benefit here, is you're learning a variety of software, and you're learning a variety of different tactics that can be used with so many different folks and in so many different ways. Okay. All right, so one of the major goals for our graduates, you may have heard of this instructional design model before, called the ADDIE model of design. So the goal with that particular model and with most models of instructional design, is to be able to plan effectively kind of what you need to achieve the ultimate best instruction that you can, then be able to design it or be able to at least deliver the overall storyboard or scope of the project to somebody who can design it. Then it would be developed, implemented, and ultimately evaluated for its usefulness within the instructional setting that it's being used for, and with also, of course, the learners that it's being used with. Besides being able to do kind of that full scope of the instructional design work, our hope is also to get folks the skill sets that they need to be able to assume more leadership roles within this field. And so many of our graduates do go on to work once again in those brevity of fields. Those who are in the K through 12 tend to kind of take over that leadership role within the technology initiatives within their schools. In higher ed, it's been a wide breadth of folks in terms of where they've ended up going, but a lot will end up taking on a little bit more of an instructional designer type role for a university. And we also see a lot of times that transition, you know, I don't know necessarily in your guys' cases where you plan on taking the degree in terms of your career. But for example, one student who comes to mind, he was a K through 12 teacher in the LA Unified School District, enjoyed it, but did want to try something new. And so we worked together during the entire summer leading up to his graduation. We put together a good application, and he applied up to Lassen College to be an instructional designer up there, and he's now the lead instructional designer for that entire campus. It's a small 2-year institution, and I think it's a team of 2 for the instruction design team. So very small, but he's the lead man. So the goal is to really put folks in that position to have the skills to be in those types of roles after completion of the degree. Okay. All right. So in terms of what kind of differentiates us a little bit from some of the other programs, as I alluded to before, since we're housed in the School of Computing and Design, our program is a little more broad in nature. We're not heavy-handed towards just K through 12 settings or just corporate training settings. We really do want people to be able to pick up skill sets from all different areas. And you'll see that a lot in our learning theory class and also in our instructional multimedia class. Whereas in a lot of the programs where the learning theories classes are very heavily focused towards kind of that target teacher group, if it's a K through 12 program, and then similarly, if it was, for example, focused towards a K through 12 program, then the technologies being taught within the program would also be really kind of pigeonholed towards that area. By our program being a little bit more broad, you'll pick up quite a few different pieces of technology. You look at Adobe Captivate, Articulate Storyline. Xerte is a newer instructional design software that's actually open source, but it's something that we look at in our program. And then even we've been working closely with a European instructional design software company called mAuthor. And so we've been testing their platform as well. So you'll get an opportunity to not just use a lot of different authoring tools like Adobe Captivate, but also a variety of different online learning management systems like Moodle. We tend to teach Moodle because we use Moodle here on campus. But other folks have been able to pick up expertise in Canvas, Blackboard, Sakai. It really does just depend on what you're looking for, okay? And then the other factor of our program is because we have both the online and the blended tracks, it tends to work well for students that are either full-time or more traditional students. When I started the program back in 2012, I had just graduated from CSUMB as an undergraduate student, just went straight in. But most, I would say about 95% of our students are full-time employed, you know, outside of taking this program. So that's usually one of the fears that I get from prospective applicants is, you know, can I really manage this program? And the hope is that you can, because we try to really focus the curriculum in a way that it's kind of a circular process where what you're doing at work can be applied to the program, and vice versa. You can hopefully take what you're learning in the MIST program, apply it to where you're at, thereby making your work a little bit easier on both ends. So that's the hope. And it tends to work out quite well for most students in the program. Okay. All right. So in terms of what the overall programs look like at a glance, I'll kind of quickly go through this information. This is traditionally for full-time students, a 4-semester program. It would start in the fall and would finish the following fall. So in this particular case for this cohort, it would be an August 2020 start and it would finish next December. The mode of study just depends on, of course, what you're applying to. For the blended program, it follows a more traditional semester format. So each course is 16 weeks at a time. And you would take more courses at once, given that the courses are a little bit longer and we can spread out the material over the course of the semester. The online terms are much shorter and they work much more like a quarter system, if you're familiar with that. So in essence, the classes end up being 8 weeks at a time, and you would take no more than 1 to 2 classes at a time, given that they're shorter time frame and we're trying to cram a little more material within that 8-week course time frame. That sometimes is a determining factor for applicants, is that difference in terms of length of time, of course. But really, in either case, the workload ends up being quite similar because you're either taking a few more courses in the blended program or you're taking less, but they're more shorter time frame to course completion in the online program. Okay. The blended program uses synchronous sessions that are in person. Once obviously the COVID situation kind of hopefully winds down sooner rather than later, then these types of sessions, the orientation sessions for classes, would take place on campus in Monterey, Seaside. And then of course, the online program is completely online, and it would just be the same as what you're doing right now. You would jump on the Zoom with your professors, and the course requirements would be completed over Zoom and of course online on your own when you're working on the individual work as well, okay? So generally speaking, for either program, there's a combination of either 1 to 2 core classes, which are 4 units, and then 1 or 2 support or elective courses that are 2 units. And the electives or the support courses are truly meant to support the core curriculum that you're learning. And I'll talk about what those classes are and what they look like and when you would take them, okay? For most students, the required credits to graduate would be 36 units. The only time that this would change is if you had units that you could transfer in, or if you were a graduate of the Cal State Teach program, we have an agreement with them to take some of their units into our program. In terms of tuition and fees, for the online program, it's roughly $18,000, and for the blended program, it's roughly about $16,000, though of course, fees are subject to change, so don't quote me. And then lastly, of course, the starting date for this particular cohort would be the 3rd week of August, with our final application deadline being May 31st for this year, okay? All right, so for the fully online curriculum, the terms here are naturally alluding to each 8 weeks. So if you combine term 1 and term 2, that would be semester 1 and so on and so forth. In term 1, you would be taking instructional technology, which is a bit more of a survey class. You're looking at the various technologies that are commonly used in the instructional design setting and learning why they're used and what they're used for. From there, you're partnered with a class called Technology Workshop, which has 2 primary goals within the class. One, it's to teach you the basics of using a learning management system. In this case, you would practice using Moodle. In future classes, you could use a different learning management system, but we start with Moodle since that's the current LMS that we use at CSU Monterey Bay. And then you also learn just some kind of ground level foundational technology skills using FTP clients, file transfer protocol clients, basic web design things, little things that you can use when you're using more advanced pieces of technology in the program. And I should probably, stop myself and slow down and say that really the goal is with each of these classes, we expect you almost to know very little or potentially even nothing going into those classes. They build from a very foundational level and then they slowly ramp up in terms of the individual classes. And of course, as the course pathway works, you're taking the previous skills from the first class that you just took and you're applying it to the next class. So many folks come in and go, I didn't have a technology type background coming into this program. Am I going to be okay? Absolutely. I was an English major coming into this program. I had no technology skills. So I was A-okay because we've used these skills or these classes to build the skills as you go, if that makes some sense, okay? Instructional design, that course, another core course, really focuses on, I hate to put it this way, but somewhat of the nitty gritty of working in the field. So those who've worked as an instructional designer would know that you use documents called instructional design documents to formulate your plan of why you would create a certain module or a certain training program. And so it teaches you kind of the ins and outs of how to formulate an overall idea for a learning module or for a training program, and really how you would, work with your stakeholders. A little bit of project management skills, I suppose, are somewhat in those classes, in that class as well. So it's giving you the breadth of kind of how to build the overall learning module that you're creating somewhat from a theoretical perspective, but also helping you to ground a little bit, okay, well, this is what I want to do here in this step of the module, so on and so forth. So you're planning a little bit, if that makes some sense. In the writing workshop class, this is trying to kind of get folks up to snuff with APA if they don't have that yet. Also helps a little bit with some of the research skills used to kind of, formulate your module once again through a theoretical framework. You want to do some research, look how other people are doing these types of things. So that's kind of the goal of that class. So the first semester is really learning the technology and also then taking the technology that you're learning a little bit and using it to apply towards the types of learning modules that you would want to create in the future, if that makes some sense. Okay. In terms 3 and 4, or semester 2 of the program, the first class is learning theory. As the title alludes, you're learning a brevity of learning theory here. Everything from behaviorism to adult learning theory. If you can think of a learning theory, you're probably going to talk about it in this class. And you can basically assume that about every week or 2 weeks in that class, you're tackling a new theory and trying to apply it to your learning audience. If applicable, or if not applicable to your audience, then you're probably working with your teammates to apply it in their setting, okay? In that term, you're also taking the first elective of the program, which is audio and video production. In our program, we teach the use of Camtasia, if you're familiar with that piece of software. If not, then you'll get to learn it. And essentially, naturally, we're trying to teach you strong audio and video production skills. So that way, you can use the videos that you're creating in the next class, Interactive Multimedia, which is teaching how to use Adobe Captivate, which is an e-learning authoring tool, or Articulate Storyline, or any of the other tools that we offer you to learn in that class. The beauty of term 4 is this is where you really get to kind of hyper-focus, I think, the core curriculum towards your individual setting that you work at. So for those who work in higher ed or plan to work in the private sector, we generally recommend that they learn Adobe Captivate in that class, because that's kind of the gold standard of the field, I suppose. When I worked as an instructional designer in the Bay Area, I used Adobe Captivate. But for our folks who are more in the P through 12 setting, we tend to recommend Articulate Storyline. It's usually a little bit easier to use, both for the person who's authoring it, but more importantly for the learners who are using it. And some of the interactions that you can create in it, such as like branching games and things of that nature, they're a little bit more easy to digest for a younger learner, okay? So that's why we tend to recommend that piece of software. So in my team, for example, we had a couple of teachers that were on my particular cohort team, and they both chose Articulate Storyline, absolutely loved it. Their students loved it. It was a ton of fun for them. And for me, I loved learning Captivate. It was incredibly relevant to my career in the future. So you'll be able to pick some software that you either think can be used right away in your setting where you work, or towards the career that you ultimately want to gain. So that's the beauty of that class, okay? But the end goal of it is to create little learning modules each week that you can use with a real world audience within that class, okay? Okay. So in the summer, just a few classes. Term 5, assessment and evaluation. Anybody who's been in education knows that we like to assess if people are actually learning when we're teaching them something. And so this is really the goal of that class, is to look back at some of the modules that you're creating and be able to learn the summative, informative evaluation process, where you're evaluating it before it's even given to the learner. And then once it's being used and there's some beta testing taking place, you can then go back and do the evaluation after the fact and see how you can improve the instruction for future use, okay? In term 6, or basically the second part of the summer semester, you'll be taking advanced instructional design. And so this is, and I haven't necessarily alluded to this too much, but in our program, we have students work on essentially a cohort team base. So you have 4 teammates with you, well, a total of 4 teammates, including yourself, who you work with throughout the program. And so in this particular class, you're working with that team of 4 with a real world client on a real instructional design project that they have, that's a need they've identified. They work with us to give you the project, and in 10 weeks, you create a functioning learning module for them that they ultimately, hopefully, end up using. So these partners have ranged from the Department of Defense, U.S. Library of Congress, people's schools that they work at, other higher education institutions. If you can think of a setting, we've probably had a project that relates to it. In this particular cohort group, we have 3 teams that are working with the Monterey County to teach their 911 call center trainees how to answer tough phone calls. So they have a real kind of scenario-based learning module that they're creating, where basically the folks that are being trained will learn essentially in as real of a setting as they can, where that way they don't have to kind of sit and just watch somebody take calls. They can practice scenarios, if that makes sense. So for example, they could practice a high-risk phone call, or they could practice, how do they get somebody off the phone line who's messing around with 911, right? So they have all these different little scenarios that they can practice so that they're prepared. Okay, I think I'm seeing something here in the chat. Okay. I'll stop here, Amy. I'll answer both your questions. So in terms of preference of Moodle over Canvas, I personally don't have one. I think this is more institutional in nature, right? So for CSUMB, we use Moodle. We call it iLearn because we've kind of modified it a little bit, but it's just a Moodle base. Many institutions are moving to Canvas. When I was doing my doctorate with Fresno State, we were using Canvas. I think both work well. I have no real preference. Normally when I do these open houses, Dr. Lara, one of the course professors, would be sitting right next to me. He would tell me what I'm going to say here, which is you would probably want to learn as much about both as you can, because just in case you change settings, the likelihood that you end up using either Moodle or Canvas is quite high. Blackboard, I'm not seeing quite as often because that's basically Canvas now, they own them. And Sakai is generally quite rare. Sakai is usually more used in a federal government setting. So by and large, it doesn't hurt to learn both, but that's something to keep in mind. And then naturally, your next question here, I'm going to go ahead and share it out here. So if we hope to create something for our current employer, can that be considered, or do we have to use outside interest only? Something I haven't alluded to yet is in the program, throughout the entire program, you're going to work on a capstone project, and that starts actually from semester 1 all the way through to the completion of the program. And so generally speaking, if you have something that your employer really wants and you want to put a good amount of time towards it, that would be something we might recommend towards more of a capstone basis. If it's something a little bit smaller, so for example, we had somebody who works in our admissions department. She's in the program right now. They wanted to create a small training for new employees in the admissions department, how to use their document kind of uploading system when they scan transcripts. She knew that wasn't something she wanted to do for a full capstone. So she let us know, hey, this is a training need that we need. We said, okay, that sounds like a great project for 626. And then that was offered up as a project for one of the teams to take on, if that makes sense. It really could fit in either an individual setting for a capstone or for your group. It just probably depends on the overall scope of the project you're looking at. So I hope that makes some sense in my answer.
Yes, thank you.
Great. All right. So as I alluded to, naturally then, the capstone is a big piece of the program. So in the final 2 terms for the online program, or in the final semester of the blended program, this is when you would kind of create the overall functioning capstone. But in the first semester, you're identifying a capstone project. In the second semester, you're grounding your capstone project in some type of learning theory that you've learned in that class. And then naturally, you're also starting to hopefully create some of the video or audio-based learning elements if that's relevant to your capstone, and potentially doing some of the modules for the capstone within the interactive multimedia class. And of course, assessment evaluation, you'd be seeing if it's going well, all of those good things as you work through the program. The other thing to keep in mind is that we have a few options for the capstone. You could do the more traditional master's thesis if that was something that you wanted to do, if you knew you were going to go on to a PhD or EDD program, which a few students do each year after they complete their master's degree. That was the route I went. I knew I wanted to go on and get a doctorate degree, so I wrote a traditional thesis. The goal there would be to publish pieces of it in academic journals. That's all fine and dandy. That's pretty rare though. I'd say probably only 1 or 2 students do that each year. Most will do the project-based capstone, where it's really, the whole goal of it is to create a solid hour of instruction, okay? So more of our K through 12 teachers will usually take a learning unit that they have, or some piece of the Common Core that they need to meet in their class, and they want to make it a little bit more interactive. That's how they'll attack that. For others, it just depends on their setting. We've had people create courses. We've had people create short training programs. It really depends. Naturally, most people get excited about the capstone. They want to create the greatest, learning module ever created to man. We just want to see a solid hour of instruction. So it kind of starts with that foundation. You can continue to build it once the program is completed. Okay. So the blended track obviously works the exact same way. The only difference here is you're just seeing where the classes are offered. They're still in the same place, just that, once again, they're within the semesters. You can see that you would take more classes. So term 1 is semester 1. You can see you generally would take 4 classes there. Term 2, you would take 3 classes with the option either being research methods if you were going to do a written capstone, or the audio and video production. You could take both. I know people that take every single class in the program. God bless them. That's a tough choice, but some people like to do that. And then obviously in term 3, you would take assessment, evaluation, and advanced instructional design together. And then in the last term, you would take the capstone alongside the other elective, which I haven't spoken of, which is our web design elective, focus on the use of HTML5 and JavaScript to create learning-based websites, okay? For this program, the orientations take place at the beginning of each semester. So for the blended program, there's a total of 5 face-to-face seminars. The first seminar is 3 days, and then each subsequent seminar kind of shortens in length. So it's 3 days for the first one, 2 for the second seminar, and then the last 2 seminars are 1 day apiece, and the final seminar is a half day where you come to campus and you deliver your capstone. The difference for the online program is that each of the orientations are held each term. So there's 8 of them, so they're a little bit shorter, and they're all online through Zoom, including the capstone presentation as well. Okay. So not to kind of say the same thing twice, but just to give, I know I talked a lot, and just to give the summary of the key curricular outcomes of the program. In semester 1, the goal is to develop a common understanding of the field and the familiarity with instruction design processes that are commonly used within it. In semester 2, the idea is to start to use some learning theories and instructional design principles to start to construct a functioning learning unit in an interactive multimedia way, okay? In the third semester, the goal is to develop and conduct appropriate usability, reliability, and efficiency tests. Once again, to make sure that the learning is taking place the way that you see or want to within the learning modules that you're creating. And then lastly, in the final semester, the goal is to wrap up the capstone that you've been working on throughout the program. And hopefully that capstone is either connecting to your current career or the career that you envision post-completion of the degree. Throughout the program, you're using interactive multimedia software every single semester, a wide brevity of information technology and many different learning media types through both team-based projects and individual learning projects. And I would say roughly about 50% of the work is individual and roughly about 50% of it is team-based, okay? But obviously that's always dependent on the class, so don't quote me. Okay. So in terms of kind of what the typical week for a MIS student looks like, or at least what I would recommend if somebody was in this program, we operate maybe a little differently than other universities in that our weeks start on a Tuesday and then they end the following Monday, and then Tuesday would signify the start of the next week, okay? So that Wednesday would be basically one of the first days of the module. You would look at it, carefully study the requirements, and probably start to do some preliminary reading that you've been assigned. Thursday, I would recommend that students continue to read. Many of the courses use a heavy discussion forum usage to try to keep you guys connected, even though many times you're kind of working in your own individual silo or just with your small teams. So we use a lot of forums, and so I would recommend trying to do those discussions early in the typical week that you're working through. On Fridays, generally recommend that students start some assignments, finish any reading that they have, ask questions of the professors. They all use Zoom quite frequently. You can call them if you are local in the area and you want to come to campus and stop by, they'd be more than happy to see you there as well, okay? And then on Saturday, that was generally the day that I just kind of sat down and I'd like to try to get as much done as I could. So I'd usually put a pretty big day in, work on as many assignments as I could in any of the activities that were within the course. And then on Sunday, I'd try to take the entire day off personally. And then on Monday and Tuesday, I would just kind of wrap up, put a little bit more tailoring in and submit stuff as needed. For me and my cohort team, We also met weekly. That's not necessarily required, but we would meet once a week for a couple of hours and just discuss any group work that we had and try to get that done during that meeting so that then the rest of the week we could focus on our individual work. And that tended to work well. And many of our teams end up taking that approach, and it works well for them as well. So just something to keep in the back of your mind if you do end up jumping into the program. Okay, naturally another big question is kind of what are the careers that many of our students go on to do? And so the goal of the program really is to prepare people for a variety of careers, and they're usually in, kind of similar but somewhat disparate fields. So first one would obviously be education technology. It's a growing field, and certainly in the Bay Area, it's huge. Not too long ago was at Coursera, and they were trying to headhunt everybody. They're trying to headhunt me, trying to headhunt students from the program. They love what we're doing. So it's certainly big education technology programs, companies you would be well prepared for. Also, more traditional instructional design / training fields naturally would be what we would be looking at, and some human performance technology fields, though I will be honest, that's a little bit smaller focus of our program, and also a little bit smaller emphasis in terms of those who end up getting jobs. So the most common titles that people get upon completion of the degree is as instructional designers or corporate trainers, or as a learning experience manager, or if they're working in the K-12 sector, many go on to be the director of STEM or education technology in their school districts. I can say that personally, one of my teammates went on to become the director of STEM for the Monterey County for a few years upon completion of the degree. So there's really quite a wide range, but many also go on to become professors or any number of items. But really the first two are the most common, either as instructional designers or as corporate trainers, either in K-12 settings or more as corporate trainers in the private sector. Okay. All right. Just in terms of some of the basic logistics, as I've alluded to before, May 31st is the final application deadline for this year. Pretty simple application process. One would just go onto the Cal State Apply website, go on there. Amy, I'm sure you could speak to this, that it's not too bad of a process, I suppose. You would go on there, you complete a few different steps, and then you would ultimately upload the required documents below, which are 2 copies. Well, excuse me, you would upload 1 copy of your transcript on this, send in an official transcript to us at the university. But then you would upload your statement of purpose, essentially detailing why you want to be in the program, how you could see it benefiting you. Hopefully you would either provide 2 letters of recommendation on the site, or you just have them emailed to me. That works quite well. If applicable, you might use some test scores like a TOEFL score. That doesn't seem to be related to this particular group. But some folks also tend to share their GRE score, not something that we require, but if you have it and you want to share it, we'll take it and we'll review it. And then if necessary, a foreign credit evaluation if you've done any education outside of the United States. Also rare, but sometimes pops up for individual student cases. In terms of what we're looking for in our background, I've tried to hopefully assuage people who might feel like what the heck is he talking about here? Really, that's probably a good sign. If you don't know a ton of what I'm talking about, that's probably about where 80% of most MIS students start. They don't have a very solid background in this field, and that's kind of the student in a lot of ways. I suppose this might sound weird. It's almost the student we're looking for. Students who do come in with an instructional design background, that's fantastic, and you end up being kind of a pillar of your cohort each year. So there's usually maybe 4 or 5 that have either worked in the field or have an undergraduate degree in the field. And you end up being like a rock star in the program because people want to learn your skills as quickly as possible. So there's a place for both, but certainly most people come into our program come in with very little background in this field. And then since we're a CSU, we just follow the CSU guidelines for what we require in terms of GPA. So if you have a 2.5 or higher GPA, you've qualified for the program in terms of GPA requirement. We don't aim to go any higher necessarily than that. So if you have a higher GPA, then you're already good to go. And really from there, as long as the statement of purpose shows that you have interest in the program, that's what we're looking for, because we just don't want somebody to write up a statement of purpose and get the feeling like this really isn't a degree for you. And so many times when I'm reading that statement of purpose, all I'm using it for is just to make sure that what they're looking for, we can do for you, the student, okay? And so if I have any concerns, usually I just allude back to your statement of purpose and just say, hey, you wrote about this in your statement of purpose. You know, can you maybe explain this a little bit more to me? So it's really more of an interactive application process, I like to believe. We're not looking to trick anybody. If you have questions during it or something's not making sense, you know, contact me. I'd be more than happy to you know, try to get to the bottom of what we're trying to figure out, if that makes some sense. Okay. All right. So if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to take them at this point. You guys have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Do I raise my hand?
Yeah, you just fire away. You're good.
Okay, great. Let's see, I have a couple of questions. And the first one is very granular, but what type of computer should we be using for this course?
It's a good question. Really, and I hate to answer it with kind of a basic response, but if it can run Adobe Captivate or Articulate Storyline, the newest version of those, then that's really what you need. So with that, there's no preference towards operating system, though I find that Adobe Captivate runs better on a Windows and Articulate Storyline runs better on a Mac. So if you're a K through 12 person, I generally recommend you have a Mac. If you're a non-K through 12 person, get a PC.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, cool. And then another question is for the master's thesis, which apparently only 2 people have done. What are there any guidelines that you can share later?
Yeah, what you'll find is the research methods class will lay it out, but it's a traditional master's thesis in that you would, you know, kind of have a statement of the problem, what your research goal is in your first chapter. Your second chapter, you would lay out a little bit of the review of the literature. Third chapter, you'd write up the methodology of the research study that you're doing. 4, you'd kind of, you know, ultimately do the data analysis and write up of it. And 5 would be the ultimate kind of summary of your findings. Because like I said before, the goal of it really is to be kind of as high of quality as possible to be a writing sample for a PhD program. Or if this is kind of going to be your last stop, then still, at least at the minimum, we'd like to do some publishing of that master's thesis so that you can have it on your resume for a future job search as well. So it'll be a pretty traditional master's thesis.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi, what were those programs that you want to make sure to be able to run?
Either Adobe Captivate, Articulate Storyline, or both. So it just depends a little bit on your individual setting. But basically, I would look a little bit at what Captivate or Articulate Storyline does and then pick one of the 2 for your individual case.
Thank you.
Yes, no problem. Any other questions that we can think of?
I have one,
yeah.
but go ahead, Molly.
Oh, there's another about the computer and the programs. For the video and multimedia production courses, are we, I guess my question, for the cohort to work together, your teams to work together on this project on the online platform, how does that happen?
Yeah, good question. So here's something that kind of comes up is that, you know, one of my other kind of things as the academic advisor is that I get to, this is going to sound kind of like creepy and weird, but I get to know you guys very well through the application process. So what I tend to do is I create teams that are either well, actually both of the following. They have different skill sets from each teammate that make a more cohesive full team that can be successful in the program. But B, I try to make them also geographically as located as possible. So that way, if you don't want to do the team meetings online, you can do them in person. That can be beneficial for some. For others, it's just not going to be realistic, and I totally get that. If that's the case, what folks tend to find useful is using what we're using tonight, and that's using Zoom, and just setting a set time each week where you say, okay, team, we're going to meet every week at 6 o'clock. You know, we all get home from work. Let's sit down for an hour and discuss what we're going to do for our teamwork. And then also just, you know, kind of help each other. Like my team, we also not only do we discuss our teamwork and don't tell the professors this, but we like to kind of help each other with our individual work a little bit and see where we're missing things and where we could improve. So our meetings would run maybe a little bit longer, but really the goal of them was for everybody to get the maximum out of each week that they could from each respective class. And I really do say this, that you'll find, because I know there's a lot of people, and I'm one of these people too, who gets a little weirded out by, oh no, I hear teamwork and I start to like shell up and get disappointed. But really, I promise you that these cohort teams, they end up becoming like your best friends. I've just been to a couple of their weddings, like in the past couple of years. It's super, super beneficial because everybody, it's a shared experience. You know, with any master's program, there's going to be a lot of highs, there's going to be a lot of lows. And you generally experience them together in a way that's beneficial for everybody to get more out of the program. So I know that answers more of your question than you necessarily asked, but I hope that makes some sense. Generally speaking, Zoom is the go-to tool for those who are not geographically kind of in a location where you could meet in person.
So for the collaborative, for them to collaborate on a project, just file sharing.
Yeah, Google Drive tends to be,
Okay.
you know, more than enough. You could use, like, we give you all server space on our School of Computing and Design server. You could use that too, but that kind of muddies the waters more than is needed. So generally speaking, Google Drive is the go-to tool for most of our students.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ryan, I realized I actually have two questions.
Yeah.
The first one's pretty quick and brief, following what Molly was asking about this idea of if you do the master's thesis, when you say something like, you know, hopefully you can even get some publishing accomplished through that, would you see that even in your capstone time that there's some assistance with making that happen?
Oh yeah. So this is something that, you know, I didn't talk about a ton in this presentation either, is that each of you will be assigned a capstone advisor by like week 8 of the program. So you're going to turn in and to be fair, your capstone project may change a little bit or go through some iterations, but you give kind of a baseline idea of, hey, this is what I'm interested in doing. And then based on that interest, we align you to the professor that has the most expertise in that particular interest. And then from there, that professor is going to work with you all throughout the program on it. And so in my case, I had Dr. Sue, who was my advisor. I was fortunate that I lived very close to campus, so I would go and see her personally once a week. But we worked on it multiple times for my thesis until it was able to be presented at a common conference in our field, or a little bit more of a bigger conference in our field, the AECT conference. And so we were able to do a couple of conference proceedings and journal publications because of that. So that was the end goal, was to get a good, solid, publishable thesis. And that was really due to her help in many ways. And it would be the same case for any of you in the program, working with your capstone advisor.
So
Okay,
Ryan,
great.
quick question.
Yeah.
I'm not much of a math person, so I'm just trying to eliminate all the math portion, you know.
Yeah.
What is the single most difficult course? I mean, with the exception of the capstone that's math heavy.
Sure. Here's what I would say is that if you don't like math, I probably like math half as much as you do. I really deplore it as a field. Okay. So I suck at math. I'm not good at it. So with that in mind, really none of the math that you're doing is too intensive. So for example, with not the summative evaluation, but the assessment and evaluation class, you're learning how to perform some pretty basic statistical functions in Excel, okay? And in your capstone, all you're doing is taking some of those basic descriptive statistics, t-testing, stuff like that, and being able to apply it so that basically you can do a little bit of a pre and post test, right? So you can see a little bit like, okay, so baseline, let's say you were teaching somebody how to shoot a basketball, right? Everybody performed that task at a 3 out of 5 on a Likert scale. Then at the end of it, everybody performed it on a 4 out of 5 scale. Then all you would basically be doing is a basic t-test to show the difference that learning took place, right? Very easy to do in Excel. So that's the level of math that we're talking about. It's nothing super duper crazy. And really with capstone and with the assessment and evaluation class, these are things that are meant to assist to check that the learning is taking place. It's not meant to be the major component of what you're doing. The major component of what you're learning and doing in this program is learning how to create learning modules that can be used in either online or face-to-face settings and incorporate heavy usage of education technology, okay? So any math that you learn is just adjunctive to that to help you to make sure that what you're doing is being successful. Does that hopefully answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, yes it does. Thank you.
Yeah, and to answer in terms of difficulty of courses, this is the benefit of our program in that it's a smaller program. We very purposely cap the amount of students at no more than a total of 40 new students per year across both programs. So i.e. if like 25 people were in the blended program, we wouldn't admit more than 15 in the online or vice versa, right? So the benefit of that is that even if a course gets a little bit more difficult, the professors have enough time to actually work with you on a more individualized level so that if something becomes difficult, they can get you unstuck, right? And the areas that people get the most stuck in the program is really two areas. One is the IST 526, the interactive multimedia for instruction, because you're generally learning a piece of software you probably have never used before, either Adobe Captivate or Articulate Storyline. So it's pretty natural that you're going to have some hiccups. So not only do you have a professor in that class, but we hire a second professor just to be there to help you out in case you get stuck, right? The other class that tends to get people a little afraid is IST 622, the assessment and evaluation class, because there's people like me who put up a block a little bit when it comes to math, and so you get really afraid, and then you start losing sight that this isn't necessarily as bad as it may seem. So Dr. Sue, who teaches that class, very caring professor and works you through in a methodology that makes it as simple as possible so that you're really learning the content and not being kind of distracted by the fact that you're maybe doing something that you might not be comfortable with. Because I know many people are not terribly comfortable with math. I identify as somebody like that. So we try to make that as simple as possible. So by and large, most people don't find the program overtly challenging, except when they're learning new skills, but it's challenging in a good way, I like to think. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions that you guys can think of?
I had one. I know you mentioned the blended program, if it does work out, that there's 3 days and then 2 and then 1 and 1.5 day.
Yeah.
On those full days, is there a pretty standard picture where you spend a lot of time in your computer labs? Is it 8 to 5? What can you say about that?
Yeah, so good question. So generally speaking, we do try to keep it in a way that it's not overwhelming. So generally speaking, it would go about 9 to 4 on those days. And you would be spending that time on campus in our business and information technology building. So yeah, there would be a pretty heavy emphasis of using the computer labs in there. So that way, just in case there's kind of some issues with somebody's personal technology, you can always use one of the computers there on campus while we're on the back end trying to, maybe troubleshoot some of the software that might be giving you some trouble. So that's part of the major goal with those two is they're there to orient you to the course and to your faculty, of course, but the second big piece of that is you would usually have me and in some cases our technology coordinator. We have a gentleman whose sole job is to help students with technology in our majors. And so he would be there as well so that we can troubleshoot technology on the back end if something's not working, because just sometimes you're doing everything right and the computer just does not want to work with you. And so we can be on the back end to try to get it unstuck, if you will. So really those days are to try to troubleshoot the technology and also really heavily teach how to use it so that when you go back kind of into your own world, you're not like, oh my God, I have no idea what I'm using here. And this is just going to completely roadblock me from being able to learn it. So we get you the foundational skills those days so that really the technology is ready to use day one, if that makes some sense.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Any last questions that might be burning for the group?
So Ryan, I know you spoke a little bit on the group work. What percentage would you say of the entire program is group work? Is it like 20%? How does it vary?
I softly say 50-50, but I think that's probably overselling some classes and it's probably underselling others. Generally speaking, I would say the majority of the work, if I was going to try to really target down a number, I would say the majority of the work is individual, and then about a third of it is really group work. But the reason I say 50-50 is there's other classes where there's a very heavy emphasis on group work. So for example, like IST 626, that's a class where basically all of the work is group work, right? Because you're working on a real client project with your team the entire semester. So it just depends a little bit on the course. But generally speaking, that's why I go with that 50-50 rate. but in most cases, you're doing most of the work on your own because a lot of the work is related back to your capstone as well. So while it's good to be able to bounce those ideas off your team, you do need to be able to kind of have that individual scope as well, if that makes some sense. So it just really does depend on the class.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Cool. There's no other questions. I'll let you guys free so you can enjoy the rest of your evening. I appreciate you guys being here. And if you do, have any questions about the program that pop up, shoot me an email, give me a chat. We have a little chat system on our website. I think a few of you have used it before. But at any time, if I can answer anything about the program, don't hesitate to ask. Okay.
Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, not a problem. All right. Bye all.